All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. From the sounds of it, there are a few people that are still on their way and are planning to attend, but we're told to move forward here. So I wanted to wish everyone a happy new year and welcome you to the second work group session for the technical standards here. The second meeting here, unlike the first meeting that we had on December 3rd, is split up. The technical standards is in the morning, obviously, and then the service quality and reliability rule sets will be covered this afternoon, starting at 1 o'clock. And Cheryl Kirkland with our staff will lead that effort. So, glad to see everyone here made it safe. I know, for me at least, some of the roads were slick in certain spots. So, glad to see you guys made it safe. Just some housekeeping items. The restroom locations, right out this door and to your left are both the men's and the women's restrooms there. The exits, there's one here and then one on the other side of the room here. Refreshments, we do have some, looks like bagels and donuts in the back there with some coffee and water. I'm sure all of you walked through the entrance here. There's a sign-in sheet there, so we ask that everyone that is participating in person here today, make sure you sign into that. We appreciate it. Just a few points which we usually make regarding the microphone. So if you speak into the microphone, we ask that you really guide it to your mouth and keep it close. It helps with clarity and make sure you're heard well. We do have people calling in through Skype, so just making sure they can hear us. If you do speak, we also ask that you state your name and then the organization you're with if you have a comment or question. So for those joining through Skype, we would prefer to have you type in any questions or comments that you have. I know last meeting for the first one there was an issue with an individual wasn't able to type in a comment. If that is the case, you press *6 to unmute yourself, and then we ask that you remute yourself by pressing *6 again. We do have a scheduled break for the morning session here for the tech standards that is set for 10:30. We will then, at the end of the meeting, we'll talk about the next steps and process moving forward. I'll plan to have the presentations and recording made available similar to the first session. We'll issue those once we have those ready to be sent and posted to the web page. So, with that, we'll get going here. Just kind of go through, talk a little bit about the first meeting's recap. So, obviously, this is the second meeting. The first meeting was December 3rd. We talked about the background and introductions. Talked about effort or what was done to trigger this work that we're doing here. We then stepped through the parts of the standards and then touched briefly on the multi-state review that's performed by staff. And today I'm going to talk about that in more detail. Then we talked about areas staff would like to, their areas of interest for staff and as we work to recommend updates to the tech standards. And then we left the meeting with an assignment for everyone, and that was to submit comments to the docket and meter type data. So the comments were anything related to recommendations for updates, things to consider, anything that you were willing to throw out there. This is just a quick slide on the agenda. I'm sure it was out there on the table for where the sign-in sheets are, but we're going to start off, well, we've already covered the first one there, but I'm next going to walk through the session number 1 comments and, kind of talk about comments that were received from various organizations and then present on the meter data that was provided. From there, I'm going to talk about the technical standards in electric service, the multi-state review that was performed by staff. And from there, I will turn it over to Brian Sheldon with our staff. He's going to give us cybersecurity update. We'll take our break at 10:30, and then Eric Pardini will, with Public Sector Consultants, will present on Public Sector Consultants multi-state review, that effort that they've been working on. So from there, we're going to hone in on the areas of focus. So during the first meeting, we kind of started off with some high-level discussions, and our goal for the second meeting here is to really narrow down into focus areas. So I'm going to talk about those starting at around 11:30. Then we'll have our closing statements, and then cover the assignment that we have for this session. We'll have another assignment just to keep things moving. We have a quick time frame and turnaround requirement for this. So just in order to keep things moving, we're hoping to keep you guys busy too. So all right, so I'm going to go into the comments that we received after the first meeting from December 3rd there. So there are multiple slides here. I'm going to touch on, I'm not going to read them word for word. I'm going to hit some of the high level points. I do ask that I welcome anyone to ask questions regarding these, but I may ask for assistance from the organization or entity that provided the comments if I don't think I am confident in answering the question. So just to give you guys a heads up. So, and again, yeah, these comments were used to like really focus in on drive down to the focus areas. So I just wanted to make that clear. All right, so the Michigan Electric Cooperative Association, or MECA, submitted the comments that you see here. The first two are related to the extension requirements that are in the technical standards. Under the first bullet there, they commented that basically, I think the intent here was that the rules may not, that specific rule may not apply to them, and they recommended potentially even deleting it or not having the cooperatives, not holding them to that requirement in the rule set. Next one here is under 411. This one, they had mentioned that there are multiple court cases and commission guidance that was provided to provide clarity around the this area of the standard. So they recommended that we should probably be careful in what we want to change here, and that changes should be that do not further the purpose should be rejected. The next one here, I failed to identify what rule this covers. So basically, this is one that ties to the communications rule set, which basically adopts the NESC into the technical standards. So we talked about bringing that into in with the technical standards. So the next one there, digital meetings should be accounted for in parts 1 and 3. And then the meter testing should be designed to take into account solid state or digital meters, which do not drift out of accuracy. Next here is, so DTE. I've got a few slides for DTEs. This is one of 3. I know that DTE in their comments, they provided some like emphasis on, you know, areas that are feasible to implement, areas that may not be feasible to implement. So what I did is, you know, called those areas out where they fell in. So the first bullet here, they supported the alignment of the technical standards with the electric supply and communications lines and associated equipment, which again is the NESC, and bringing those into the tech standards pending review. They felt that that was feasible to implement. The second bullet here supports eliminating the reference to the billing rules. They also felt that this was feasible to implement. on the last bullet here, welcomes the possibility of updating the extension service rules and incorporating cybersecurity requirements. Second of three here, so DTE also supports staff establishing a subgroup to evaluate the metering rule set changes, relatively feasible to implement, and I'll talk about this later as well, but as of right now, we have some recent efforts with this. We are working with utilities and their meter testing experts to we actually have a call on January 15th to kind of go over introductions and then talk about the objective of what we're trying to do here. And then on January 24th, we have a meeting at DTE's facilities for this work. So the second bullet here, meter location requirements are on the webpage guide and are basically available for the customers on that. So we had talked about potentially bringing in meter location requirements. And I know there were a lot of questions during the last session about what does this mean, like what types of meter location requirements. But DTE has shared that they have that available to their customers on the webpage guide. DOE's definition should be used for defining AMI. And then the last bullet here, would like to propose a definition for serious injury for a future work group session. And serious injury was one of those elements that staff was hoping to, we talked about it and we're hoping to put a definition to. DTE's, the last set of comments here, the first bullet here is related to the inspection program, and DTE does not recommend specific O&M requirements related to preventative maintenance at this time. They feel that these are illustrated in the distribution plans under U-20130. Next one here under the Rule 505, so this is the line clearance program. And DTE feels that notifications and audit processes for tree trimming are in distribution plan for the ETTP, which is their enhanced tree trimming program. Okay, thanks. Which is where they are best suited. Then the last bullet here, they recommended establishing work groups in areas of meter requirement rules, which I had mentioned we sort of have kicked this off. For review of the read rate standards for AMI, analog, and AMR meters. So moving on to Consumers Energy's comments. The first one here is under the Rule 411 for extension of facilities. They recommended clarification be provided through the case law, or they state that clarification is provided through the case law and commission decisions, which would be undetermined by revisions. They felt that this was least feasible to implement, and similar to DTE, Consumers hit on areas that they felt were most feasible and least feasible to implement. So second bullet here under 504, this is the inspection program requirement. Additional discussion and analysis needs to be performed to assess the feasibility of additional programs beyond overhead line inspection program. They felt like this was feasible to implement. 505, the line clearance program. A few different comments for this one. So they recommended that the language be updated from tree trimming to line clearing. They felt that tree trimming doesn't include tree removals or herbicide treatments, which are typically, those are typically things that are performed for vegetation management. Next one here, 100% tree trimming notice would be difficult. Would be difficult and would undermine the legality of the easement rights. They felt that this was the least feasible to implement. And then the last one here, 100% post-tree trimming audits would result in significant cost increases. They felt that this was the least feasible to implement. Next slide here, first bullet under 604, meter removal tests. They felt that the accuracy needs to be added to the testing language to be more specific. Under 605, metering electrical quantities, they felt that the obsolete electromechanical meter language should be removed and updated for net metering reference in under 3 of the rule set there. Next one under rules 606, 609. So these fall into the meter requirements. They felt that remove the obsolete electromechanical meter language in these specific rules. Moving on, next point here is under 608. So demand meter requirements. These should be deleted. Under 610 here, voltmeter accuracy, remove that pertaining to analog devices. And under 613 for meter testing, remove the electromechanical meter language for demand meters. And then they also feel that additional research should be performed to look at the differences between ANSI Z 1.9 and Z 1.4, which we had talked about during the first session as well. All right, so 618 generating meter tests, they felt that these should be updated to test generating meters every 24 months. Next one under 701 here is AC standard frequency. So to eliminate the language, the specific language of the satisfactory operation of customers' clocks which are connected to the system, there's a comment that there are very few clocks that are synchronized to the grid, and that we should take a look at the NERC language. There were a few specific references in their comments for that. So taking a look at what NERC has, and then potentially bringing in you know, the 59.5 to 60.5 hertz. And then under 702 here, the nominal service voltage. They felt that costly upgrades would be needed if the range of acceptable variation was reduced. I don't mean to put consumers on the spot, but I was a little bit confused by this one. I didn't know exactly what that meant, but I don't know if...
Yeah, thanks, Taylor. This is Don Lind with Consumers Energy. It was just an observation that we have a nominal service voltage range today that we've planned to and designed our system to. So if the rule was changed to narrow that range of acceptable variation, right, we'd have to go make additional investments because there may be customers on the one end of the circuit that are at the high end and the other end that are at the low end. And so that we've planned around that variation. That was why we mentioned the costly upgrades.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Thank you for that. That's in line with what I expected, but yeah, I wasn't real clear on it, so thank you. So that sums up Consumers Energy's comments. Next is Michigan Electric and Gas Association, or MEGA. Their comment as it related to the technical standards was with the inspection program under 504. They mentioned that this rule allows for the utility to create its own program based on the needs and experience, and they felt that it worked well as it is right now, given the fact that utility companies are unique. Next, New Energy Advisors comments. They felt that tracking and reporting of momentary interruption should be considered with AMI and grid automation. This is an area that actually we're considering. I think it's an area that kind of could fall under the service quality rule sets or the tech standard. So it's one that we're thinking about where we want to put it, and depending on the language and what we come up with during the work group sessions here, will probably have an impact on where that goes. But this is something we want to consider, given that, and actually, in the comment, they provided a document that shows the impacts, or I guess the the cost of momentary interruptions as they relate to other interruptions, which is compared to other interruptions fairly high. So their thought was to, make sure that we consider the momentary interruptions given the information that we have available through AMI with most companies as it stands now. So, and then the creators of the last bullet here, the creators of the ICE calculator acknowledge the importance of accounting for momentary interruptions. So next one here, Association of Businesses Advocating Tariff Equity. So Abate commented on Rule 411 here. So Abate, they commented and said the rule is obsolete and has nothing to do with the tech standards. They also mentioned that there's no clear statute to authorize the customer complaints to the rule. They recommended that this rule in its entirety be eliminated and at least have some amendments, if it's not deleted, in areas of 2, 7, 8, and 11 of the rule. And they also, if the rule set is kept to, they suggested defining customer. All right, so the next one here, Citizens Utility Board of Michigan. So CUB commented, they supported staff's recommendation to consider mandating that utilities submit the annual safety reports of OSHA incidents and injuries requiring medical attention. So this is something we talked about during the first session, and I'll talk about this a little bit. I think I touched on it in the multi-state review. So we found that other states are also doing this. So the last bullet here, CUB supported staff's recommendation to consider requiring a report for each major service interruption. This is also an area that we feel could fall under the service quality rules as well. So we can definitely talk about that as we work forward here. Marco's got a question.
Marco Brazano with DTE Energy. Just a quick question. As you're considering some that could fall in the technical standards or the service quality and reliability standards, is your thought that you would just pick one of those and it would fit in one to avoid, potential needing for reporting across multiple areas?
So I'll share my thoughts. I think that right now it's a little soon to know exactly where they're going to be. So I think the work group efforts that we have will kind of guide where they ultimately end up. So no, I don't think they would be in both. So yeah.
I would envision that they'd just be in one and it would encompass everything, when bifurcated. But we're open for suggestions. So thank you.
Yeah. And part of the homework assignment will be to submit comments. So if you feel that, hey, if you feel strong that this should be a service quality requirement or vice versa, feel free to share that. We're certainly open to your guys' comments and feedback. Okay, so that basically summarizes or concludes the comments portion that we received. I'm now going to jump into the second portion of the assignment from the first meeting, which was for the utilities to submit the types of meters that they have in their system.
Taylor?
Yeah.
We had comments on Skype.
Okay.
Abate said, what does MECA believe is the purpose of Rule 411? And also that they believe that Section 3503 should more clearly define the reserve margin and maybe align with the MISO requirement.
Okay. Was that question? Were they expecting MECA to respond?
I don't know.
Okay.
Maybe if MECA wants to say something now.
Yeah. Okay.
Not to put Dan on the spot.
Yeah. Right.
I have a quick question. This is Pat Poley. Did Abate submit those comments? in their written comments? The
Not,
same ones about the reserve margin?
no, they just,
Okay.
no, they're not in their
Just
written
ask them.
comments, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so the MECA submitted the meter types to the docket, and this is a quick overview of the different co-ops and the meters that they have in their system. So the goal of this was to sort of drive down to what meters are we dealing with, what meters should we be drafting these recommended updates for. We realize that obviously we're migrating towards a lot of the digital metering, and AMI has been the recent push, but we're looking to make sure we are considering all rules that are in the system, or excuse me, meters that are in the system. So Presqu'île Electric and Gas currently has electromechanical or analog meters, AMR, and then I provided the numbers of meters that they have in their system if those were provided in the comments. So that's what the 12 reflects there, and also the 20 for AMI. So I did want to also emphasize that in the summary that they see here, I really broke the meters down into really three main categories. So electromechanical, analog, AMR, and then AMI. And then again, percentages and numbers are shown in the information here if that was provided in the comment from the company. So MEC Electric currently 100% AMR in 5 years moving forward. They don't expect any changes from that. I realize I skipped Presqu'île's 5-year plan, so 100% AMI 5 years and beyond. Homeworks Tri-County, they currently have the electromechanical or analog meters in the system. 11 AMI, they're at around 1,100, and then AMR is 26,000. Their 5-year plan is no changes. And then Cherryland currently has 100% AMI, and then no changes 5 years or beyond. Second slide for the information that MECA provided. Ontonagon currently at 100% AMR. 5-year plan is 100% AMI. Great Lakes is 100% AMI and no change in the future. We've got Thumb here, who is currently at 50% analog and 50% AMI. And then their 5-year plan is 100% AMI by the end of 2020. And then Elder Delta is has AMR currently and plans on 100% AMI by the end of 2020. Looking at the information that DTE provided for their meters, I just took the table here that they provided in their comments. So they currently have majority of AMI in their system. They also have a few of the analog meters, looks like around 100 or so in the system at this point in time. So their 5-year plan is to leverage AMI and replace end-of-life meters with AMI as needed. No specific plans for 5 years and beyond. All right, this is Consumers Energy's information that they provided for their meters. So again, this table was taken directly from their response, and they currently have AMI, digital, and analog. And then their 5-year plan is to eliminate the electromechanical. I apologize, this is maybe a little bit difficult to read for you guys, but on the top portion of the table that they have here, it goes into their AMI meters, and then the communicating and non-communicating digital meters, and then single phase and polyphase electromechanical. So they have a few more of the electromechanical meters in their system as compared to DTE. Consumers has right around 5,200 of them in the system. Michigan Electric and Gas Association, the meters that they provided, so Alpena, the meter type information they provided. So Alpena's currently at 100% AMR, don't expect any changes 5 years and beyond. Indiana, Michigan are currently have analog AMR and AMI, and in 5 years and beyond, they anticipate AMI being adopted. And then Northern States Power currently has 100% AMR, and then their 5-year plan is for AMI in 2024 to 2025 timeframe. I just kind of wanted to talk about the conclusions that we got from the information that was provided. So generally speaking, everyone's moving towards the digital AMI type of meters. 5 years and beyond, we do see there being analog meters and electromechanical meters being in the system still. So I think that's something we really want to consider as we look at the updates to the meter requirements, that, hey, we're still going to have analog meters in the system. So the current requirements are heavily related to the analog meters. So we feel that we're still going to have those analog requirements, but we certainly want to update the rule set to incorporate the modern meters in the system. So that concludes the comments and summary of the comments that were submitted after the first session. Does anyone have questions regarding the comments or the meter type information that was provided? Pat?
Hi, this is Pat Hudson, staff for MPSC. As we look at these definitions for meters, and that's a category of, defining the meters, it seems like analog, AMI, digital transmitting, and maybe digital non-transmitting, they're categories that we may want to consider definitions different than before, when the assumption was everything was electromechanical. So I don't know what the conversation has been like for, secluding the definitions, but it'd probably be helpful because they're all in the system.
Thanks, Pat. All right, does anybody else have anything? Anything through Skype, Nick? All right. All right, so I'm going to move on to cover the multi-state review that staff performed for the technical standards for electric service. Following the energy assessment, there was a multi-state review for the service quality and reliability standards that was posted to the energy assessment docket, which is at 20464. The commission, through order and also in the energy assessment, basically asked staff to look into what other states are doing as we look at these rule sets. So this is the information that you see here. Okay, so I'm going to touch on the state selection and the methodology behind selecting the states that we did. So we looked for states that were precedent setting. Some that really come to mind are California, Minnesota, and New York. We also wanted to make sure that we considered states that are in the Midwest that share the same, weather patterns and vegetation type of vegetation that Michigan does. We see that in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Wisconsin, we see those as being good, states to look at for that. And then also wanted to look at states who experience extreme weather events, we wanted to look at how they handle, reliability and resiliency in their system. So Massachusetts and New Jersey were they were considered for that. driving down more a little bit to, so we had the states, and then we we thought about the technical standards themselves and tried to like hone in on what areas we want to focus, like what do we want to look at these states for, because in looking at the technical standards, especially you know, if you're looking at them across the United States and other states, there's a lot of information, a lot of requirements, and a lot of reading to do. So we were hoping to sort of narrow our research down a little bit into these topic areas that we explored. So under the first one here, we looked at the main elements of the technical standards. We found that some states, so I'll say that I reached out to NARUC for this, and they said, well, what do you mean by technical standards? Because it's so open-ended and broad that they didn't really know exactly what our ask was. Well, we found that a lot of states have consider their interconnection rules and things like that as part of their technical standards. So we really wanted to look at these states and look at the main elements of their what we consider to be their technical standards. Under number 2 here, another main thing we wanted to look at was meter testing and accuracy requirements. This has been one that's been definitely one that we, it's a focus area for the technical standards that we want to make sure we update given the modern meters in with the modern meters that we have in our system. Third one here, we wanted to take a look at any cybersecurity requirements that states have. You're going to find that it's pretty minimal to nothing with cybersecurity requirements. Under number 4 here, how technological advancements are being considered in the standards. Again, this kind of ties in with the metering, but how states are handling this. And then under number 5 here, the O&M requirements. We wanted to take a look at what states have for preventative maintenance requirements and also tree trimming and things like that. So. I did want to mention, because I figure the question is going to be asked, whether or not staff's report is finalized at this point. At this point, it's in draft form for the tech standards. Our thought was to keep it in draft form because we feel that we may need it to evolve a little bit based on the focus areas that we go into. So for instance, if we want to look at what other states are doing for their line extension requirements under 411, we could keep it open and include those in our research, just as an example. Or incident reporting and things like that, see what other states are doing. So next I'm going to step through each of the 10 states and cover sort of the observations that we had as we looked at the states. So for California, it was found that they have arguably the most extensive O&M requirements. They have annual reporting of inspections. They have inspection intervals. They call out specific intervals for their poles for which they need to be inspected, various equipment in the system, substation equipment, very specific in those areas. And they also have very stringent record-keeping requirements related to O&M. So minimal metering requirements, and then the cybersecurity were, oh, sorry, Mark was going.
Marco Berzano again with DT Energy. I was curious about the California requirements, and if when you were looking at it, you had a sense of timing of when those requirements were put in place, and if they were a recent response to the wildfires and other issues that they had with the San Bruno explosions, and you know, if they were sort of recently introduced in response to those catastrophes. Thanks.
That's a good point, Marco. Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to that, but I have a good idea of the answer. But anyway, that's why I did provide, I failed to mention, I provided a link to really the rule sets. So these are the areas where we pulled the information from. It's like a home page, so it calls out all the areas of the rules, and then so you may have to search a little bit for what I'm talking about here, but that's kind of why I provided this link, is so you can go in there and see what they have exactly word for word, and then look at things like when the rules were. Yep. All right, the next state here, so Illinois felt that they had extensive metering requirements, and typically when I say extensive metering, I felt like I feel like Michigan has pretty extensive metering requirements, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are incorporating the modern meters in the system at this point. It's just the metering requirements themselves were fairly extensive in the rule sets. Extensive vegetation management requirements. So, and they specified non-emergency in their rules, which I think I think it's a good consideration to look at emergency versus non-emergency if we, as we work to recommend updates in this area. I know that for Illinois specifically, they have reporting. They were heavy on notifications, so the notifications were required to mayors, county boards, any affected customers or property owners in the area. They also, in their vegetation management rules, talked about, they incorporated an ANSI A300 standard, which we incorporate the NESC, and we found that a lot of other states also include that ANSI 300 standard, so something we'll also look at is the standards that we incorporate. I guess.
Maybe give a reminder to mute. I don't know who's doing that on the Skype.
Yeah, hold.
Just a minute. Let's see if we can. Yay.
All right, I think we're good to keep going. I guess.
I have a question, Taylor. So on the last slide, California, you talked about extensive O&M. Is your, and you don't have O&M on here necessarily in that category. Are you only making note of things that struck you, and then how they compare to Michigan? What was your method in terms of the bullet points you provided?
Yeah, so really these were the areas that, so obviously in looking at what Michigan has compared to them, but these were really the things that stuck out to us as we compared the two. So we felt that, for instance, if we look at California, they had more extensive O&M requirements than what Michigan has. Is that, oh, okay, thanks, Pat. For Illinois here, the cybersecurity requirements, they didn't have any requirements that we could see. And obviously there's the link to their homepage for their rules. Moving on to Indiana here, so they had extensive vegetation management requirements as compared to Michigan. And they required a notice to, that must be a typo. Apologize for that. Notice to media and content requirements. They had various tree trimming standards. They also incorporated ANSI A300 to their rule set. They had the NESC. There was I think I'm pronouncing this right, but a Shigo guide. I've never heard of it okay. Shigo, okay. Shigo guide. And then the International Society of Best Management Practices, they also incorporated. So they basically said you can use any of these standards for your vegetation management program.
I have a quick question. What is the SHIGO guide? I had not heard of it.
I don't know that.
Alex Shigo, that's Michael Connor, Consumers Energy. Alex Shigo was a tree physiologist, a professor at a university. He developed a guide for trimming for utilities. It basically was called natural pruning or directional trimming. Try to trim a tree so that future growth is growing away from the power line. So he has a little guidebook that most utilities use.
Thank you for that. So yeah, so Indiana has various tree trimming standards that they incorporate into their rule set, and then they also have a customer education program that I think that's specific to Indiana. I haven't seen that in any other states that we looked at for that, I'd say. So Indiana didn't have any cybersecurity requirements that we could see either. Moving on to Massachusetts here. So again, extensive vegetation management requirements for notification, but theirs was for transmission only. Obviously, with Michigan here, we have very little transmission. And the standards apply to distribution only. So the second one here, extensive emergency operations and reporting requirements for those emergency operations. So they're required filing of the emergency response plans. And then no cybersecurity requirements that Massachusetts had. And going back to the emergency response plans, they are filed for department, basically the commission review and approval. So the commission actually approves of these plans as well. So it sounded to me like they put their stamp of approval on it, which was interesting, I thought. The emergency response plan included emergency contacts, customer communication details, and things like mutual assistance agreements and things like that. Minnesota has extensive reporting requirements for incidents, safety, meter reading performance, etc. Minnesota had defined a major interruption, which we are planning to. We'll talk about it a little bit later when we talk about focus areas, but that's one of the phrases that we're looking to define as a major interruption. And then Minnesota also has the OSHA safety requirements, similar to what Michigan has, but they also require that those be filed for submittal of report with the commission. And then they also had meter reading performance reported on a monthly basis as a percentage of the meters read. Then the minimal meter testing requirements. Then cybersecurity there were no cyber requirements. So New Jersey also had extensive vegetation management requirements. I feel that New Jersey and Indiana had the most extensive and detailed requirements for vegetation management. And for New Jersey here, they included inspections prior to and throughout the year for vegetation management. They had hazard trees. Their requirements asked them to address hazard trees. And they also go into training and qualifications, public notice of vegetation management activities, and then annual public education outreach programs. They also incorporate multiple tree trim standards, ANSI A300 being one of those, best management practices of utility pruning of trees being another. And they also had ANSI Z133.1 incorporated for tree trimming. and then the NESC. No cybersecurity requirements that we could see in New Jersey. New York observations, their advanced technology requirements seem to be fairly extensive, so they require the utilities to record momentary interruptions and voltage sags, swells, etc. And really appear to consider the AMI capabilities when talking about that area. So under the second bullet there, extensive meter testing guidance. Now, they had identified it as guidance, so it wasn't exactly a requirement in the rule, but it was sort of a guide that they had on their webpage. So, and then for New York, they also have some recent cybersecurity efforts, from what we could see, requiring additional information provided through their IT systems. So there are no known requirements, but that was something we discovered in our review. So moving on to Ohio observations. So they also have advanced technology requirements, recording of momentary interruptions with the modern meters that they have in their system, considering the modern meters in the system. And then extensive metering requirements. Again, the metering requirements are really, pertaining to analog meters. We felt not so much the modern meters that may be in the system. Minimal distribution O&M requirements, and then there are no cybersecurity requirements for Ohio. So taking a look at Washington, they extensive meter testing requirements, advanced technology requirements. They required a smart grid report, which was an annual report submitted to the commission, which included a description of the smart grid technologies that the utility plans to be a part of their system, and the evaluation of the cyber and physical security that has been performed by the utility. So that kind of ties in with the cyber piece. That's why I brought in minimal cybersecurity requirements, because they do hit on cyber a little bit, but not too in depth there. So the last state, Wisconsin, extensive metering requirements, no cyber requirements, and then they did have vegetation management requirements that required notification to landowners. And their focus for tree trimming requirements was really on oak tree trimming. So pretty interesting there to a specific species. So, all right. So the conclusions, these are really the areas that basically the things that stuck out to us as, hey, we feel like these need to be explored as we continue on in this work group effort, based on the topics that we explored. So I talked about the topics of, general, looking at the technical standards in their entirety, O&M requirements, meter requirements. So these are related to those specific topics that I covered in the first few slides of this deck. So the state's meter testing and accuracy requirements are the most consistent, but do not always reflect modern meters. States have minimal to no cybersecurity requirements in the actual rule sets themselves, although there appears to be quite a bit of activity and related to cybersecurity, just no official rules or anything.
Thanks again, Don. Marco Brazano again with DT Energy. Question before we move off the cybersecurity comment, and I don't know if you got any sense of this. Cybersecurity is obviously a big deal for the industry. Is there a sense that because there's such a very heavy NERC regulation around NERC SIP, for the critical infrastructure protections, that states may not feel a need to intervene because it's already being covered and they don't want to do anything that's redundant or potentially in conflict with that? Did you get any sense of that in the research?
I will let either Alex or Brian speak to that.
Yeah, so it's hard to say. Oh, yeah, sorry. Brian Sheldon, Commission staff, and you'll be hearing from me quite a bit in just a minute. So it's hard to say why other states aren't touching this. I have some theories, but I would think that NERC being in existence is part of it. And it's also a little bit about staff expertise. Do state commissions have the capability to take this on? And it's a question that we're wrestling with a little bit, and we're going to talk about more in just a minute.
All right, the third bullet there. States are starting to require additional information with technological advances and additional information through AMI. We felt like we're sort of getting into that right now with these more modern, or the modern meters who have additional information to offer. So fourth bullet, states have more prescriptive vegetation management requirements as compared to Michigan. And then O&M and preventative maintenance requirements are not typically prescriptive in what we saw. But I did want to go back to that last one. So there were a few instances where there were reporting requirements related to that. So conclusions beyond the major topics that we explored. So in looking at these states and going through their requirements, we found some areas that were interesting to us that we thought should be brought to the table. So states have meter location requirements. States require annual OSHA safety reports. So we have in Michigan the safety basically say that you need to follow OSHA requirements, but we don't have the requirement to report any incidents or anything like that, which we found some states do. States have more prescriptive vegetation management requirements. States have more prescriptive incident reporting requirements, and also the NESC is the most common incorporated for the design and installation for distribution systems. So with that concludes the information that I plan to share for the multi-state review that staff performed. Are there any questions from anyone? All right, one through Skype.
Yep. Okay, so Laura Sherman with EIBC said, can staff comment on when the plans in other states were most recently updated? Again, this is Nick Evans from Commission staff. I can say for California and Minnesota and Wisconsin, I don't know as far as when the rules were updated and any plans that were required were updated. I guess, do you want to comment on other states?
There's nothing that really sticks out to me, but we can definitely look into that. I think it's a good thing to look into. All right, if there's nothing else, next I'll turn it over to Brian Sheldon. He'll give the cybersecurity update, and then we'll have a break. Looks like we're really close to being spot on here, so we'll have a break at around 10:30 or when Brian's done here. So.
Good morning, everyone. So as Taylor had mentioned, my name is Brian Sheldon. I am the lead on issues related, or proposed changes to technical standards related to cybersecurity. I am also guided by my boss over there at the table, Alex Marisi, and so he and I jointly will be managing this and trying to answer any questions you may have. So in December, it was mentioned that the Commission is strongly looking at including additional language related to cybersecurity in the technical standards. And so I just want to provide a little bit more context behind that today. It's still very much a work in progress. But hopefully this will give you a sense of kind of where we're thinking and how we're going to approach this and get some of your feedback and questions answered. So before we go into that, I'd like to first talk about what's in the rules currently. So all of the, I shouldn't say all, but I think the large majority of anything related to cybersecurity and the technical standards is contained in Rule 205. And so that is a relatively new rule. It went into effect, I guess that's a year ago tomorrow. So it's existed for about a year. And it's has really two high-level requirements. The rule itself is about 3/4 of a page long, but two high-level requirements. The first is that utilities must provide MPSC staff with a written or oral report about the utility's
You've been
cybersecurity
muted.
program.
To unmute yourself, press *6.
So the second requirement is that what we refer to internally as sort of crisis communications. In the event a utility experiences a cyber incident that is severe, and we have some thresholds in the rule, that's something that the commission staff would like to know about. I think it's about just making sure we're on the same page and making sure there's not inconsistent messaging going on. So the first 2051 is about keeping us updated on an annual basis about what the utility cybersecurity program is. And the second part is notifying us in the event of a serious cyber incident. So as I had mentioned, this has been in effect for about a year, and we've had the pleasure of meeting with every electric utility in the state over the last 12 months. And I would say that even though this is a new rule and we kind of didn't model it off of any other state, the feedback has been quite good. Folks have been really receptive to this, and I think we've learned a lot, and we were able to share a lot of our learnings with the utilities that we've interacted with. And so we also had an opportunity this summer to meet in Chicago with a bunch of our peers at commissions in the Midwest states, and this was sort of recognized as a best practice, and NARUC staff and DOE talked about kind of this model of commission staff engaging with utility peers on cybersecurity has been pretty well received. And so
You're no longer muted.
We've been pretty happy with that. And there are now efforts underway to sort of take this and replicate it in the gas technical standards as well. So we have some utilities that are just gas only. And so there's efforts to do that. And really it's more or less swapping out electric for gas, and that pretty much does it. So there are a couple things that have come up in that process that I just want to flag for you. I tend to think of them as more clarifying edits than they are anything substantive changes to Rule 205. But I just want to flag those for you now. So the big takeaway here on Rule 205 from at least my perspective, and I think many others on staff, is that we're not looking at substantive changes to Rule 205 currently, although we're open to your feedback on that. But there may be some needed changes for clarity and consistency with what's going on the gas side. Okay, so the first issue I was made aware of, and again, the gas stakeholder process and the rule comment period, I think maybe even still open. So these are kind of coming to light recently. But a comment was made in that docket about the term electric provider as it's used in the gas standards version of Rule 205 versus the term utility. So it's a definitional question, and the comment essentially is that there's some daylight between the term electric provider and utility, and maybe some confusion about whether electric provider would also include alternative gas suppliers. And so as that pertains to us on the electric side, there's a question about whether electric provider is the right term we want to use in Rule 205, or should that actually say utility to be clearer. So that's not a discussion that we've had internally. It's something that we've just been made aware of, and I want to return the favor and make you aware of that. So, second issue is a change, and this is actually in the proposed gas technical standards, is a reference to the Michigan data breach law. And what you see underscored by electric is that the whole goal of this was one of the thresholds where if you, a utility, experience a data breach as that's defined by the Michigan Data Breach Law or the Identity Theft Protection Act, then that's a threshold that you would have to notify customers and so on. That's something that you should notify the commission first. So that was one of our thresholds. If it's a statutory data breach, please notify us. After the the staff and attorneys worked it, they came up with the language up at the top that's tied to the term personal information in the Michigan statute. And through the gas process, somebody had sort of thought that that was a little bit wordy and clumsy and came up with a better way to phrase it, and that's written below in the gas. So now it's tied to the concept of security breach versus a breach of personal information. So from a staff perspective, I see that as probably just a clarifying change and not really a change to the substance of what we're trying to accomplish in Rule 205, but I just wanted to put that on your radar that we may be looking to propose something like that in the electric side as well. So kind of with that, maybe we're about to switch gears a little bit. So any questions about Rule 205, what we may be thinking about doing there, or anything along those lines? All right, so let's now take a look at what we're envisioning maybe would be in technical standards added to the cybersecurity language added to the technical standards. So the basis here comes from the statewide energy assessment, which, paraphrasing here, instructed staff in recommendation S2 to look at the technical standards and evaluate what opportunities there are to improve cybersecurity for electric distribution. And I can say very candidly that when this was released in the summer, that in meetings with our leadership, it's been sort of recognized that there is a gap here that needs to be addressed. And so it sort of shifted from let's look for opportunities to this is something that we need to do something about. And so myself and Alex have been tasked with trying to come up with what this might look like and what sort of information it would contain. And we're trying to sort of relay the framework we have in mind. We don't have language quite yet, but sort of a framework of how we're looking at it, and to kind of get that on your radar before we develop a straw proposal. Okay, so this actually relates a little bit to Marco's comment earlier about there are a lot of challenges for a state to take this on, and so these are all of, and probably not an exhaustive list, all of the things that we are trying to balance as we think about what new cybersecurity standards would look like for electric distribution. And so the first is a comment. We have a few utilities who their parent organization covers many states. And so as security is generally centralized at the parent company, you want to make sure that you're not running afoul of jurisdictional problems at other states and other laws. And so that's definitely an issue we're trying to tackle. The other is broad applicability. I think we really didn't want to do a whole bunch of carve-outs saying if you have X number of customers, you fall into this category. It adds to a complexity that I think we wanted to try and avoid. So we wanted to kind of go up a higher level and make it broadly applicable and therefore less likely to conflict as you cross jurisdictional boundaries. So a kind of a high level look at this. Number three, we want it to be built on best practices. So we've done a lot of reading. As you can tell, we're just told there's not a lot of information from other states. I mean, it's always nice to copy other states. In this, we don't have that benefit. So we're trying to really start with something high level and get moving on that. And so we're building it off of the recognized guidance that we get from DHS and DOE and NARUC and EPRI and everywhere else. So we think we are on that track, but we're always looking for expertise and input on what those best practices should be. Number 4 is we really want it to be flexible. We want to leave the decisions, sort of this day-to-day security management, to the security managers themselves. So we don't want to do security for you. We just kind of want to put some targets out there and leave the day-to-day decisions and the specific controls and what goes where to the utility security managers. Number 5 is balancing the compliance security trade-off. I think it's a really real concern that we've heard that when commissions do something like this or new laws go into effect, that it ends up doing a lot more work on terms of compliance than it does actually changing the security operations of that impacted entity. So we really wanted to make compliance not be burdensome, basically, because we don't want, and some utilities have maybe 1 or 2 IT security people, and we really don't want to draw them away from doing sort of security and into just endless paperwork. So we're also trying to make sure that compliance is relatively straightforward as well. Another issue is instant obsolescence, maybe instant overselling it, but this is a really evolving area, and so if you get too specific, you end up in this trap where you'll have to continually update, and updating rules is hard. And so we want to avoid that to the extent we can. And lastly, this was part of my answer to Marco earlier, is that we can't overextend ourselves. So we're being cognizant of the burden that's placed on utility security professionals, but also on ourselves and our ability to track all this down and ensure compliance and all that. So we want to make compliance simple for us in the way it'd be simple for utilities. All right, so again, still working on language, but as we envision it, we could see a new rule with requirements that fall into one of 2 categories. So the first category is what I'm generally saying: have procedures to accomplish a security objective and then follow them. And so again, we're taking a high level best practice and leaving the how you meet that objective up to the utilities themselves. So an example, again, none of this is a proposal per se, but just kind of a thought exercise. So to respond to and recover from a cybersecurity incident. So that would be the goal. And the requirement would be that the utility has to have procedures to accomplish that goal. By and large, from our conversations, this is already happening. This is something that we ask all utilities when we go meet with them, and there's some level of planning about what they would do in the event of an incident already. And so in many ways, this is probably just reinforcing some practices that are already either formalized or perhaps informal, but need a little bit more structure. So another would be to identify and remediate software vulnerabilities. Everybody is doing this on some level, but again, we don't want to specify how often you have to scan, how you prioritize your patching, how much testing you do before you patch, and all of that we want to leave to you. Okay, so that's the first sort of bucket of requirements. High level, here's an objective. Make sure you have procedures to meet that objective and follow those procedures. Okay, the second would be a little bit more definitive. So it's complete a specific cybersecurity task within a specified time frame. So an example here would be the second one listed, conduct employee phishing tests. So something like 90% of all cybersecurity incidents start with phishing, and so it's something that, from the Commission's perspective, we need to make sure that people are really addressing this. And so we have put down there as quarterly as a time frame. Again, this is all kind of just hypothetical, but we believe folks should be running phishing campaigns on their staff and on their leadership to make sure that they're kind of always on awareness for phishing. But again, not specifying what your click rate should be or how difficult the phishing email, none of that. But this is a practice that we want to support. Another example would be exercising your incident response plan. So we talked about you need to have procedures to respond to a cyber incident, but you also should exercise them. So what's the appropriate time frame for that? We kind of throw out annually, but it could be less than that. It could be more than that. We're obviously just kind of brainstorming a little bit. So that's kind of the gist of it. So everything that we are thinking of right now would fall into one of those two buckets. And so the last thing to cover then would, okay, so those are the requirements. What would compliance look like? So as one of the ideas that I think is a leading contender for us is compliance would be an attestation from an official of the utility who is authorized to sort of vouch for the cybersecurity program. So it would be maybe a once a year, sign a form that says, I attest that we're in compliance with this. And 99 times out of 100, that would be all that is necessary in terms of compliance. However, I would say that and I have no idea, the commission reserved the right to do whatever they think is appropriate in the future, so I can't really speculate on what they will or won't do, but it also leaves open the opportunity for, if a data breach occurs, for example, that you could evaluate these procedures, take a look at whether they make sense, were they followed, should there be changes, and also the utility or the commission could request that a third-party auditor takes a look at this and evaluates whether there's compliance there. And so, again, most days, blue sky days, you would expect that just a once a year sort of attestation would be sufficient for compliance, but a deeper look may be warranted if there's an issue or unfortunately a bad thing happens. So, okay, so pretty hard to kind of wrap your head around something that's just kind of on a slide here, but sure.
I just seem to have a lot to say today, so must be just coming back from vacation. So Marco Brzano with DT again. And we also, Joe Robinson is here. So I'm the VP of Engineering, and I have responsibility for NERC SIP compliance activities. Joe Robinson, who's our Director of Engineering, led our NERC compliance office for a number of years. I would say just reaction, appreciate the thoughtfulness that's going into this. And I think from my perspective, you're thinking about thoroughly, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Just one observation on that last bullet point, which on the previous page, which was requesting a third-party audit against a rule. We have very, very heavy auditing requirements that come from Reliability First, which manages NERC SIP compliance for NERC. It's very, very extensive. We have an entire department that is dedicated to NERC SIP compliance. So to the extent that you felt that the very, very deep audit that Reliability First does could, and you getting access to that information and reviewing it and getting it comfortable could comply with that request, I would just ask that you maybe give that some consideration as opposed to having an entirely different third party that may have a different approach and limited accountability for the outcomes could be one thing to think about. And I don't know, Joe, do you want to add anything? Okay, all right, thanks.
Absolutely, good comment. And that is something we've considered, but one of the wrinkles there is that not all Michigan electric utilities are subject to NERC SIP, and so there's a little bit of a wrinkle there. But this is just sort of us brainstorming of what a commission might request in terms of if they think there's a persistent issue, a third party or a NERC SIP audit might substitute for that. Okay, one final thing, and then we'll answer your questions and hit breaks. So next step for us is we're trying as a staff to work up a rule that sort of comports with the framework I've just outlined. So again, we're trying to meet all of those objectives, and I think you've seen some of the some of the language that we're expecting to probably include, so it wouldn't be a surprise. And it depends on how much progress we make, but we're looking at February as a target to put out a straw proposal to get your feedback and start working through language. And this is also an area that may make sense to form a little subgroup to kind of tackle this apart from the mainstream process going through here. So that's another idea we're kicking around. And we're also trying to, one of the benefits of Rule 205 is that we've met a lot of our peers at utilities, and we have pretty good relationships. And so we're also trying to do some outreach on this to try and kind of explain some of the same things I did in a whirlwind today, and answer any questions they have and gather any feedback that we can incorporate as we develop this straw man. So that's something that we just recently kicked off. And so if your technical staff have questions or want to sit down with us, we're more than happy to do that. Okay. With that, I know that was a lot. Sure, question.
Yes, question from Skype. Do you feel a third-party audit would be for the specific question or issue at hand or the entire program?
So again, just brainstorming, but I think it would be if there is whatever the third-party audit would address whatever the concern is. So if there's a concern that there's non-compliance with the entirety of the rule itself or certain elements of the rule, that third-party audit would target the area of concern.
Douglas Jester, Five Lakes Energy. Number of comments have been made about working around or with NERC-CIP and other applicable standards. You also have talked about extending these standards to gas utilities, and I'm concerned there might be a little bit of a gap in the discussion there because of having different regulatory bodies on the gas side. So I am basically soliciting comment from those in the business to address that.
This is Pat Hudson again with MPSC staff, and just a little tie-in on what Taylor did earlier when he talked about the research that staff did from other states, and it generally came up no cybersecurity requirements. And what Brian just presented to you was a framework of what the discussion is right now to possibly have it being embedded in technical standards. Just keep in mind that those other states that might not have requirements, that doesn't mean there's not activity. There's NIST standard, NIST framework standards, and there's a lot of things other states are doing. I think what Michigan is doing with this effort is trying to see if there can be some kind of guidance and flexibility, as Brian described, but some kind of guidance that's just tied in to the technical standards. That delineation is important because there's lots of activity going on throughout the country. It's just, this goes a little step further in terms of nailing a bit of a framework down. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, Brian.
No, you've got it. There's a lot of activity. I think states we've seen have just been hesitant to, or for whatever reason, have not sort of turned this into rules, right? So there are practices that some of them have existed for quite a while, but haven't found their way into rules. So there's a lot of activity, but when you actually go and do a rule review, it's pretty barren. And you're also seeing sort of selective parts. Like I'd seen some work in New York related to supply chain and vetting of vendors, but that's just one sort of subset. And I think the task that was provided to us was something a bit more broad. But you're right, Pat, that there's a lot of work underway. And I do want to have a follow up to Doug's comment earlier. There is on the gas side, I just want to clarify one thing. They're looking to take Rule 205, which is the cybersecurity reporting part, and put that in the gas side. So that is underway. In terms of standards, which we're talking about as something new here, The gas team has opted to push for an API standard. I think it's 1137, but it relates to SCADA security. And so the gas team is sort of addressing this challenge about standards for gas and with an industry standard, and we're looking at it at a different approach because we're not, frankly, aware of anything that we could take off the shelf and use for electric distribution. And so there's a distinction there. I just wanted to flag that.
Hey, Brian, Keith Axtell with Consumers Energy. Yeah, I believe that API standard is 11.4, just for clarity.
It's 1164, not 1137.
Okay, thank you.
That's the clarification.
Thank you. Too many numbers.
My name is John Langmore. I'm just a retired faculty member. I have two questions. One is what you mean by a tariff, and the second one is why penalty was not on your list, because I would think that providing some incentive to the electric companies to avoid a problem by maybe having a penalty, if there is one. You know, they have customer satisfaction payments when they mess up with the billing and stuff like that. Shouldn't there be payments to the consumers if there is a problem with their reliability or a problem with their identity theft? And how does that play into all of this?
So, yeah, complex question. So there would be a penalty associated with a rule violation. Is that correct?
Well,
not
in terms
attorney.
of monetary
Yeah.
assessments, we have a limited ability to do that. So that's kind of a authority that's prescribed, that we don't necessarily have broad authority in that area. So, you know, in a lot of these things, I don't think any utility wants to be in the news as being that utility that caused identity theft. Or so in this particular area, some of that is self-policing, I believe. But there could be multiple areas where you would assess a fine for noncompliance. The commission always has the ability to issue a show cause order that requires a utility to show cause why they haven't complied with specific commission directives. So again, that particular type of a case is also, I'm quite sure, not one a utility wants to be in the position of responding to. So there are more things that besides monetary assessments. But I think also we're talking about a phased approach to things too. Just getting awareness of cybersecurity. You know, it's a baby step. Certainly not perfect, but it's a baby step. My thoughts. And this was Pat Foley.
Can you explain what you meant by tariff?
I don't think I could do it. Can you help me
Well,
with that?
tariffs are the utility books that describe all the requirements. So we have all utility tariff books. It's their rates. It says what they can charge. It says what they're required to do. And so we have those in the commission office, and you can also access utility tariffs from the utility itself. So it's what they are required to do, and they can't change their tariffs without a proceeding and approval from the commission. So it's what our customer service people use also to see if there's been a violation when people make complaints.
So for the customers, if there is a cybersecurity breach, if they wanted to recover from that, from the economic impact of that, they would have to file suit.
You could file, a customer could file a complaint.
But shouldn't there be a more streamlined procedure?
And what should be the appropriate delineation for a loss of data? Does it depend on whether it's a social security number versus an address versus? I think it's really a thorny issue, but I agree with you in the sense that it does seem just to compensate people who are harmed in the event that they were harmed in a data breach.
But the customer,
the customer has a couple avenues for complaints. They can work with the utility with the complaint, just the utility themselves, and if they're not happy with the result of that, they can come to the commission and file a complaint. So the utility is set up to address concerns that a customer would have that are not, typical.
And the other thing that I would add is it's not required, but it's common and customary to provide the affected party with identity theft protection or packages along those lines. So does that mean that makes you whole for what the consequence was? Not necessarily, but there is some level of consideration there. Okay. Any others?
We have a break scheduled for how long, Taylor? Well, 10? Okay, we'll give 15 minutes from now, so we'll be back at 10 to 11.
Thanks, everyone.
We have coffee and donuts in the back if anyone needs any.
So in looking at the agenda, next up we have Eric Pardini, who's going to talk about the multi-state review. But before we jump into Eric's presentation, Commissioner Scripps wanted to say a few words.
Thanks, Taylor. So I want to basically just say thank you to all of you for participating in this. It's really important work for the commission. Obviously, it's a deep commitment among our staff, but it really is the folks who are willing to show up on Skype or in person on a snowy day and add their voices to the discussion and try and find where there's common ground and what we can do to make sure that we're delivering the level of energy, natural gas, and electricity service to Michigan customers that they need. And this is, it's front of mind for a number of reasons. I think you've seen that commitment play out over the last year through the statewide energy assessment that Pat led and that Taylor was lead on some of this on the work groups now. It's part of My Power Grid that Taylor and Cheryl are leading, the commitment on cybersecurity that you heard from Brian and Alex and that team. And it really is, I think, front of mind for a lot of us. And today, I think we're seeing that it's front of mind for the rest of the world too. So even as we're here talking about sort of the nuances and granularity of how to make the standards work and everything else, we've got across the world, front page of USA Today is talking about the increased risk of cyber attacks from Iran. We got an email today from Lara, all of us at the commission, saying, watch your emails, phishing, everything else. And in The Guardian today, they quote a professor of cybersecurity policy from Tufts University Fletcher School saying, is Iran equipped to take out the power grid for a major portion of the populace? From the way they are talking right now, it sounds as if they do have those kind of capabilities, and this might be the moment they consider using them. So this is, I know it's detailed work. It is rulemaking, which is not the fastest or most exciting thing, but this is where the rubber hits the road. And the work is better because of your involvement. The work is better because of the discussions, because of the insights, because of the expertise that you bring, whether you're energy providers or represent other stakeholders. It's important that the voices get heard and that we have a solid basis of understanding and then a record on which to build and go forward in order to make sure that we are equipping ourselves for the 21st century and the modern threats that we face in the same way that we have over the past. So again, I'm going to let Eric actually get into more substance, but I just wanted to say thank you. It really does, your participation is what makes this work, and we at the Commission consider this a top priority, and we couldn't do the work that we do without you. So thanks.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Scripps. So next we'll bring up Eric Pardini. He's with Public Sector Consultants, and he's going to talk about the multi-state review that he's performed in this effort. So with that, I'll turn it over to Eric. Thanks.
Everyone take a break now? No. So yeah, like Taylor said, I'm Eric Pardini, director with Public Sector Consultants. We're a nonpartisan public policy research and consulting firm based in Lansing, Michigan. Got to talk into it. Okay, thanks, Pat. Do that. Maybe can I use the moving one? All right, is that better? So sorry, we're based in Lansing, Michigan. We've been around for almost 40 years now. We have several business lines. I work for our energy environment practice, but we also do work in education, talent, workforce development, as well as health and human services. So we're very actively engaged in policy in Michigan in various different streams. We are a full suite we offer a full suite of services. You'll see us often, presenting economic contribution analysis on various industries in the state. We'll do in-depth research projects like the one I'm about to present on today. We also implement and evaluate many sort of policy programming options. So in the energy space, you might be familiar with Michigan Saves, which is a energy efficiency investment vehicle that we administer through PSC. Our project team that can't do this alone, so I'm going to get into sort of a really in-depth research project that we've undertaken. So just want to give a shout out to some of my partners who are deep in the weeds with me on some of this work. So Maggie Pallone is leading up our investigation of administrative rule setting procedures so that as we look at other states, we understand how these processes are undertaken in different states and what it looks like to actually promulgate these rules and whether there's differences and or examples that Michigan can learn from. And then I've got Darrell Slaughter, who's probably familiar to most of you or many of the commission staff, who's helping out on the technical review side and the performance benchmarking. And then Alec Esparza and Jill Steiner helping to round out the research. So what are we doing here? We were engaged. So after the statewide energy assessment was released and the initial multi-state review of service quality and reliability standards was released in an appendix to that, we were talking with, I think, contacts from DTE Energy about, hey, these 10 states are great, but are there other practices we need to be aware of? What else is happening in this space specifically related to service quality and reliability standards that we should be aware of? And what's a good approach for being able to maybe inventory and do some benchmarking on a more comprehensive level? So through those discussions, it evolved, and we've ended up sort of creating a team of people to work with on this project. So PSC is working directly with DTE, consumers, and Mega on this analysis. And later the work was expanded to include the technical side. So I'll be touching on sort of both of those in this presentation and actually presenting again to the second work group later today. So our work ultimately turned to focus on both aspects of this work group. So we're looking at the service quality reliability piece and then the technical standards. So I'm going to walk through today a little bit of our methodology, what we've done to select additional states for inclusion in that analysis, as well as what our project timeline is and sort of where the analysis stands, and answer some questions from folks. So the first goal was, as the state looks at this, recognizing the hard work that had been done on the multi-state analysis during the statewide energy assessment, was to help see if we could further define what states are doing. And we specifically wanted to look at peer states. And so that'll be the sort of first topic of our scope definition that I'll get into. But defining peer states became is a tricky thing. When we look at what can Michigan look at as far as practices in states that look like us, there's a lot of ways to sort of define that. But after the states were selected, we wanted to focus on how do we analyze how Michigan's current standards, are there corollary standards in other states? Are there best practices that can be identified? What are the common practices that states have had? And really, where does Michigan stand as far as, are we lagging? Are we leading? And to be able to have just a better definition of that. So that's the sort of necessary context that I would say is really helpful, especially as this work group sort of evolves and additional topics are identified for exploration. So we have a 4-phase approach. Right now, we're right smack in the middle of sort of developing the study and completing the research and analysis portion. But we started with that scope definition, like I said, looking at what states we want to include in this, why those states were included, and what's important as far as consideration of peers for a benchmarking analysis. And then reviewing the existing standards in Michigan. So getting really comfortable and familiar with the types of rules that we have. Part of this analysis is focusing on we require a lot of service quality reliability reporting, and we've got standards and performance levels that are articulated in those standards. So how well does Michigan currently stack up based on sort of complying with those standards? So that's one thing we're exploring. And then the next piece was, after those states were selected and we evaluated Michigan's performance, what are other states doing? And then a final study is currently in process. So as far as scope definition goes, I talked to Cheryl from the Public Service Commission staff after I think the reference was mentioned in the statewide energy assessment to say, hey, what states did you look at and why did you look at them? Because I think that's always a really important question, is how did you get here with these states? So we looked at, so the 10 states that were included are listed on the board, and you're probably familiar with, as all of you, probably dove into that information. But the criteria that was given was geographic representation, so that we had some varied points of view covering the Midwest, East Coast, and West Coast, as well as states that are recognized for setting precedent with their policies, or states that you see major storms occurring. So starting off that basis, we said, I think that's a good place for inclusion. We didn't want to be duplicative in the effort, and so we actually had a conversation initially with staff to say, if we went ahead and included these in our review, would that be overly redundant, or would it be, would it be something where we'd be stepping on toes? And I think the reaction was, I think there's more. And if you look at this 10-state analysis, it really focused in on some key priorities, similar to what Taylor presented today with their review of the technical standards, sort of narrowed the scope to look at, here are the key priorities as identified. And we said what we would do in our approach is look at every one of the rules contained in these two packages. So something like 54 rules in the technical side, and something like 25. And that number is a little bit fuzzy for me because we are doing some limitation just based on if there's procedural elements or things that are less directly comparable to other states. So at the end of the day, we decided that we would use the 10 states included in the Public Service Commission analysis as a starting point for our work. That brought us to the next part of our work, which was really to get a good sample of what else. So we started with this idea of, can we do 25 states? 25 states seems reasonable. Part of that is bounded in the sensitivity of how can we get this work done in the time that it's of use to this work group and to participants who are looking to make changes for Michigan standards. And so we sort of set that number out there. But before we sort of put that hard and fast in stone, we said we wanted to come up with a methodology that would allow us to select states based on sort of pure criteria. So what we did was we brainstormed a list of variables that we wanted to consider as far as what is important as far as its relation to reliability, and what do we think would be good measures for Michigan's comparison and the ultimate selection of states. So we ended up with 47 different variables, quite a lot of actually. The appendix to this slide deck lists those out, and they cover everything from all of the reliability indices. So we looked at SAIDI, SAIFI, and CAIDI, both with and without major event days. We looked at characteristics of the electric industries in states. So that's, what percent of their load is from commercial industrial customers, to how big is their electric system from a capacity or line mileage basis, what percent of their infrastructure is undergrounded. We really tried to cover a wide swath of those characteristics for the industry. Then we looked at state characteristics, and this is things like demographics. So how has population changed over time as we see certain states, like Michigan, where we've had declining or low population growth? Does that have any significance as far as the state's ability to continue to invest in our distribution infrastructure? And then we looked at tree cover, because obviously we all know trees are a major driver of outages in the state. So we were able to reference some information that looks at the density of tree cover, both statewide, but also in urban areas versus rural areas, the amount of tree cover per capita, really to try and define what, how states look from that perspective, to say, is Michigan necessarily comparable to South Dakota? I mean, I don't know if you've ever driven across that stretch of, the Black Hills of South Dakota. It doesn't look a lot like the Michigan I've grown up in. So that was one of the things where we wanted to sort of filter to say, is this something that's relevant to the selection of states? And the last was storms and weather, obviously another big determining factor for how states' reliability is impacted. And so we looked at, the frequency of outages. We looked at heating and cooling profiles for states, various other things. So obviously, there's a very fun and colorful Excel workbook that's coded that I'd love to share if you really want to have your eyes crossed for a little while. So, but from there, wasn't enough to say from those 47 variables, here's, how do you make sense of that information? How do you find what is the signal in that noise? And so what we did was we decided to apply correlation tests. And sorry, before I move on to that, I do want to give a shout out. So both the teams at DT, Consumers, and Mega, and helpful in crafting that list, but also I did ask for and received really great input from Public Service Commission staff as far as what kind of variables they would like to look at. I think one of which was the inclusion of underground plant infrastructure. So fun exercise of getting some FERC Form 1 data to be able to calculate what % of overall distribution plant is in underground infrastructure. So I think really ended up helping the analysis. So thanks again to staff for that time investment and for feeling having the willingness to contribute in that way. All right, so from there, what we said was we couldn't sort based on 47 variables, so we had to define some significance here. So what we wanted to do was define how correlated the variables that we identified were to reliability performance. So we ran statistical analysis, and we're able to define that 9 of the 37 variables that were not reliability indices are correlated or were statistically significant in their correlation to reliability performance. And so we said that's something we can work with. That's the amount of states that we can, or that's the amount of variables that we can now use to sort the states that we were interested in. So probably no surprise to many in this room, what were some of those major, those highly correlated variables. So you see % of tree cover in states as being the number 1. Actually, there were 3 of the tree cover variables that we considered were all in there. We ultimately just sort of narrowed that down to 1 because they were really similar as far as both like their nominal values, but also their statistical significance. The other piece was % of a state population living in an urban area was one of those top predictors for or top indicators for reliability performance in a state. The others were the extent of underground utility infrastructure, % of sales to commercial industrial customers, population change since 2010, and then the average annual frequency of emergencies, incidents, and disturbances. And lastly, how do states report outages, whether it's automatic or it's manual? So after we had those statistics, those variables identified, we ran additional descriptive statistics so we could identify the mean, median, standard deviation, and also quartile performance so we could rank these states. So we looked at, for these 9 variables, those statistics to be able to say, okay, where does Michigan fall first? And then what is a good grouping of states that we would say have similar performance to Michigan on one of those standards? And so that's where we looked at states that shared quartile performance. But then we also looked at states where there was sort of a grouping of around sort of a Michigan and using the standard deviation from the mean as sort of as a useful tool in that. The only case where we had a slightly different perspective on how we group states was as far for tree cover. And this came from a good suggestion from one of the folks on the client team where we wanted to significantly close the gap because when you look at the standard deviation for states in tree cover, when you've got states like Nevada and then you have states like Michigan, there's a really wide spread there. So you get a pretty significant sort of lag on the standard deviation, both above and below the mean. And so we decided that created too wide of a gap, and we wanted to narrow that down to look at states that were more closely related to Michigan. But for the rest of the states, we decided to look within that sort of upper and lower with the standard deviation from the mean, as long as Michigan landed within that, and in most cases, Michigan was within that standard deviation. So from those variables, we were able to sort of parse out exactly how we would go sorting. So I described this as my funnel filter process, where we started at the top with all of the states going in, and we applied the first level of test, which was to look at what are the most significant variables first, what are the states that align with those significant variables, and then what states have no alignment and should be left out of analysis. And so we sort of work our way down in 3 tiers. So the first layer applied tree cover. It applied the percent of population living in an urban area, and it applied the extent of infrastructure that was undergrounded. So from those 3 variables, we were able to do our first set of filtration. So just a little overview of how the data looked for Michigan. Michigan's 59.5% tree cover, higher than the national average at 44%. We're firmly in the 3rd quartile there. You'd be surprised at some states that have incredibly high tree cover. Obviously, like New Hampshire, Vermont are up there. But I was surprised at some of the Connecticut's and Delaware's that I think of as heavily urbanized areas as actually having really high tree cover. Similarly, we were in the 3rd quartile for our percent of population living in urban areas at 74.6, just higher than the national average on this metric. And then for distribution plant, again, this was for Form 1 data, so only available for the major electric utilities as far as we were able to analyze. But from that, we found that Michigan had 14.8% of their distribution infrastructure undergrounded, slightly lower than the national average at 21%. So all of that said, we then compared how states looked in that sort of those bounds that I defined earlier. So the first filter we applied was, are there any states that have shared characteristics to Michigan on all 3 of those variables? Sure enough, there were. We found 5 states that were similar with their characteristics and their performance on those 3 variables. So Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Virginia. So what we said was, great, we're going to grab those. Those are our tier 1 states. These are what need to be included in our analysis. So great, we started with the MPSC's 10 states. We've got 5 more. Okay, next thing we wanted to do was, how many states have two out of these 3 that they have similar performance in? Do we want to select all those? And we found out there were 19 of those states, the remaining states, that had that shared performance. And so we wanted to apply some additional levels of filtration to be able to further narrow that list. So states, and then the states that didn't have any connection as far as those variables or only had 1, we opted to put aside until we sort of went through the rest of the selection process. Tier 2, we looked at percent of this involves the next 2 variables with that had statistical significance, and so we sort of had that layered approach like I described. So percent of commercial industrial customers as far as their contribution to retail sales, and then the population change in states. Of the 16 states that were identified as having shared characteristics in Tier 1, we found that the following states had shared similarities on these 2 variables. So Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. So we added these 6 states to the analysis as our Tier 2 states. So now we're at 11 states that we've selected through Tier 1 and Tier 2. And we've got the additional 10 states from the MPSC's thing. But we are left over. There are still 6 states that had 1 shared variable. So if you're counting along with me, you've got 4 states that were eliminated from this selection process. So we've set those aside with the earlier states that were eliminated. So we wanted to do one more step. We could likely have included all 6 states. But again, each state sort of has like every state we add adds additional layers, and we're trying to make sure that this project can be completed in time for being useful for this work group, this and the service quality work group. So we decided for that 3rd tier to look at those 6 states. So the 3rd tier, we took the final 2 variables where we had demonstrated levels of correlation, and we said, okay, we're gonna apply this last filter and see what we come out with. We used average annual frequency of electric emergency incidents and disturbances, as well as customers whose outages are automatically reported. Of the 6 states that were moved on from Tier 2, we ended up with 4. So Connecticut, Missouri, Oregon, and Texas were added to our list for the analysis. And so we ended up with having 15 states. I think we sort of set out with 25 in mind, and I promise I didn't create this methodology to actually land on this, and we ran it a few different ways, and we were able to filter out. And if we had, if there were similar states that had really high performance in these 3rd categories, they would have ended up in that bucket. But I think we're happy with the list of states that we ended up with. So with the 15 that are in there, you've got them broken down in tiers here. So you can see Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. What I would like to emphasize here is that while Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina, Virginia had very similar performance on those main metrics. A state like Connecticut wouldn't have gotten into this filtration or to tier 3 if it didn't have some shared similarities. So if we hadn't eliminated states as we went, and we hadn't moved states onto further rounds, sort of like your NCAA bracket, right? Like you had to perform well in the early rounds even to make it to these later rounds. So I don't want to overly distinguish that these states are the most like Michigan and these states aren't really like Michigan, because they all have similarities, right? And so I would like to say, they're tier 3, tier 2, and tier 1 in our selection, but don't take that for level of importance or how maybe applicable their rules and standards could be to Michigan. For those of you like me who like to see it on a map, I think this is a good way of looking at it. So we get a really high concentration. So the MPSC's original list had sort of gathered sort of our regional neighbors that we traditionally think about as peer states, sort of in that industrial Midwest. But we captured a good number of other states that sort of covered the plains area, but also in this on the Atlantic seaboard. So I think we've got good coastal representation. So if we go back to what were the goals the MPSC had articulated in their state selection initially, coastal representation, regional representation, but also having sort of a mix of other states to be considering. So the addition of, say, an Oregon, that's a state that actually we found has pretty well developed policies on a service quality reliability front. I think then we've also got sort of on the smaller side of these states, we've got the high density Connecticut, but small as far as overall size. And then the addition of, say, a Pennsylvania, I think is really strong from a regional perspective, a state that has a lot of comparability to Michigan. So I'm going to pause there for a second because I think that's a lot of information, and see if there's any questions first before I talk about sort of remaining elements of the study and then where we're at today. Yeah.
Eric, Pat Hudson with the MPSC. Two questions about variables or conditions that were either considered or not. One would be temperature, because temperature can translate to ice in particular areas. And the other one would be regulated versus non-regulated as a variable for that state's condition.
Yeah, so there were, and so I actually have a memo that summarizes all of the things that were considered and weren't considered, and I could share that. So as far as temperature, we did heating and cooling degree data. So that was as close as we got to. We didn't go with an annual sort of state average temperature, like on a seasonal basis. We decided heating degree days generally gives you an indication of how often homes are having to, and I think the NWS, the National Weather Service calculations, very, very specific. And the number of heating degree days isn't the number of days, it's the number of incidences or minutes or hours. I have to look back at that, where the temperature is below a certain threshold, right? And so it captures sort of the times where you would have those. It doesn't capture the extreme colds, right? It wouldn't say that in 2016, Michigan's winter temperature was 14 degrees or whatever. But it does get you close to that sort of a temperature index for the state. As far as the regulatory structure, this was suggested, and we had some conversations about in the earlier portions. My thought was, and the reason we didn't include that was, one, it was a binary, the regulator not right, because we could include hybrids in there. But largely, because we're talking about electric distribution infrastructure, my thought was, and the rationale for leaving it out was, states aren't generally looking at, they're not deregulating the distribution grid aspects, right? This is happening at the generation side. While there could be some changes that happen based on that, because this is distribution focused, we decided to not look at that as a variable to consider. I will say, as we review the technical standards, there are several elements where regulatory structure come into consideration. So when we talk about Michigan has a technical standard for the requirements for both electric generation, construction, maintenance, inspection, and reliability, but also overall electric generation like capacity and the ability to have a reserve requirement in the state. We do see that in the deregulated states that we're looking at, say California, New York, or Massachusetts, those functions are handled much differently in those states than they would say they would be in a Michigan rule. So we do see some differences, in that. But as far as the service quality reliability piece, we found that relatively there's a lot of similarity now that we're into. Oh, sorry. Any other questions? I'll move on. I got to go back to my slide. All right, so after we selected states, this is where the fun begins. So 2 phases of the research. Phase 1 is, okay, we've got the states identified, but before we go after what states are doing on these different standards, we wanted to first check how does Michigan actually perform based on its existing service quality reliability standards. So because of the annual reporting that's required and because of the explicit definitions around unacceptable performance and acceptable performance, we decided that we would compile performance on the utility basis based on annual filings, and then aggregate that to say how well does Michigan perform. So really the question there is, are these moving the needle? Are the current standards in Michigan, do they have an impact? So that involves how many times are waivers granted during outages for utilities. Like, how often are there extreme circumstances? How often are we defining outages as catastrophic versus normal operating conditions? Just to be able to start to understand if Michigan, if the existing rules really are something that over time you're seeing an improvement in performance. That just helps us as we go into the second phase where we're looking at other states to say, hey, if Michigan's having demonstrated performance improvement year over year, then maybe you don't have to look at what this other state's doing because you're consistently improving. Where other states have, say Massachusetts, for example, they have basically defined the growth trajectory that they want all utilities to be on as far as comparison to historical performance averages, and then that is continued into the future with periodic review. Where Michigan's rules don't sort of establish that, so we wanted to measure whether that improvement is happening. The second piece was, like I mentioned, how do states set administrative rules for these industries? Is it the common practice that states are putting all of this information into rules? Is it defined in statutes? I've really found that there's sort of 4 buckets of the way states are handling this. The first is states that have statutes that are really, really detailed and have a lot of information in them. So the idea that you would promulgate a rule based on that statute when the statute already has a significant level of definition, you wouldn't really. So you see certain states where their rules packages aren't as detailed as you would see in Michigan or others. But then you look at their statutes, and their statutes have a lot of that definition that we would see in rules. The second is states that statute defers to the rules and promulgating authority for the commission. I would say that maybe more similar to Michigan, sort of that category where the statute defines the overall powers and what can be done, and then the rules get to the sort of the granularity and that level of detail that you can expect to see from states. The third tier, I would say, is where their rules packages really don't get to that level of detail, but what they do is define how the commission shall behave and what types of regulatory proceedings these rules or these standards can be administered through. And so there's a series of states where, Connecticut, Kansas to some extent, Massachusetts, Virginia to some extent, where their rules packages really, from my research perspective, leave a lot to be desired because I love when all this stuff's in one place and easily accessible. But what they've done is they've created a system where through other regulatory proceedings, you see the same standards or rules adopted and in use, just a different tactic for how that happens. So we are calling that out as we go through the research. So there will be an inventory of, okay, how do states typically look at these types of rule setting? But also, what are the other avenues that states can pursue that may not be explicitly through the administrative rules procedures? So the next piece was really getting to the nitty gritty of the analysis. So I was talking to Douglas during the break, how once you take 56 standards plus 25 standards, and you then look at 25 states, you start to look at a lot of data. And so we've got some pretty extensive data. We did some pretty extensive data collection where we had gathered rules, then we had sort of keyword coded them and tagged them so that we could begin to sort. And so we did that first at the statewide level, compiling the different rules from the states that we selected. And then the next phase of that was to then map those to Michigan's rules. Because I think the first layer of analysis we wanted to do was, do states have similar standards to Michigan? If so, what are the differences sort of along? Can we define, a high, like what's the most restrictive versus what's the most permissive practice? What is there a common? Is there a grouping of state practices that we can look at, and is there the ability to identify a best practice based on how states have sought to set these rules? And then the next piece was, are there places where Michigan either has a standard that doesn't exist elsewhere, or are there places where we see standards that are less common and aren't reflected in Michigan's package? So those are sort of the three layers we've been applying to this analysis. So first, Michigan related, and then stuff Michigan doesn't have, and then stuff Michigan has and others don't have. So we're starting to call those things out through this process. We have made notes where states don't have standards that reflect that look similar to Michigan. In fact, I think Georgia is one on our list where there's very limited information that the state actually requires relative to this, and we've called their public service commission. We've tried knocking on those doors, and I don't know if others have really tried to go deep into other states' regulatory commission websites, but you can really find some 1990s like web browsers that are can make you laugh a little bit, but also make the data collection hard. So we do end up cultivating those relationships with state public service commissions, because maybe it's the fact that this isn't something that's digitally produced. A lot of them will give you a caveat to say, this is the last time this rule package was adopted, and you need to see the Office of the Great Seal or the State Secretary of State to actually get the updated package. And most of the time they're relatively current, but you do see some of those data lags just as far as updating these go. So a lot of times it's, we're able to get good data directly from state websites or through dockets, but we've also, in the cases of, say, a Georgia and Massachusetts, actually, for a couple things, we're having to work directly. But largely, most states have some sort of standards that are typical for service quality, reliability, and technical standards. So we are, like I said, we're in that process right now of defining this. We have also in our mind, as we go through this process, to see where states are really thinking about the future of the electric industry. So one of the places where that's mentioned is in the technical standards discussion that's happened thus far is, how do we look at advanced metering infrastructure? There's a lot of granular requirements relative to meter testing and this type of polyphase meter versus single phase meter versus transformer connected meter to, there's a lot of that detail in there. And looking at how states, for example, are they keeping those rules, or as they get to ubiquitous access to AMI, are they moving to a standard that is maybe more future proof for what this technology could look like? So we are trying to identify specific instances where the rules are trying to map to the rapid deployment and development of new technologies in the space. And actually, one of the states we examined actually has a specific, it's not one of the rules, but a commission practice of how do we prepare for and how are we ready for those things that are coming around the bend. And I think those are really important, especially as we talk about things like cybersecurity and making sure that Michigan stays on the forefront for being protective and ensuring long-term reliability. So final piece right now, literally right now, we are finishing, we finished the compilation, and so we're in the writing phase. The technical standards piece is still in draft form where I'm working on that, but I have delivered my first draft of the service quality reliability piece. So I have a little bit more full consideration and understanding of sort of the performance of Michigan standards to others. The technical piece, as Taylor and I were commiserating, is just there is a lot of detail there. So trying to parse out what's explicitly, what you can explicitly measure Michigan against other states for can be challenging. So we're still trying to figure out the best way to present that information so it's useful to folks in this room and elsewhere. Because if it's, if I'm telling you that the metering facility service requirements are this, and this, does that necessarily help you as someone who's looking at updating the standards? Or is it more important to say, do states require you to have your own metering testing facility? Is that still something that's a common practice versus that you must test your voltmeter every 3 months and it must be within, millivolt of, of detection, right? Like these are some of the things that we're trying to make sure that in this technical summary that the information there is truly useful. So our goal is, and we're planning to have this draft, the report drafts both completed and reviewed in the January timeframe, working to have all that information gathered and ready for sharing ahead of a February meeting. So that is a current focus for me. I want to open it up to questions. So that's a lot. I'm sorry, I can answer maybe some questions you may have on sort of early preliminary results, but wanted to speak today just so that this room had sort of an idea of the additional information we're hoping to supply, making sure that our efforts are complementary to the work that staff has already done going into this, but also useful and revelatory for folks in this room who are going to be engaged in these discussions.
Any questions? Thanks, Eric.
Great, thanks everyone.
All right, greatly appreciate that, Eric. It's been a pleasure working with you up to this point, and we see the work that you're doing with that as being beneficial as we work forward and recommending updates to the rules here. So, thank you. So, next up on the agenda, I'm going to walk through some of the work group areas of focus, and then we'll go into closing remarks and everything, and talk about an assignment that we have before the next meeting. So, with the areas of focus, so we were working as a staff to figure out where we are and where we want to be, and we do plan to have a red line version at some point for the technical standards and service quality as well. And as a next step in getting to that point, we want to make sure that we drive down to specific areas of focus to sort of concentrate our efforts and work that we're doing as we move forward here. So I'm going to talk about those areas of focus as we see them right now. So what I did here is did some color coding, and the idea is to provide a little bit better organization for where we're going. It is used, the colors are used for the coming slides as well to help make the connection with the specific parts of the rules. But I know, so for the definitions portion here, we see this as being an area that, so we've talked about some of the definitions that we may want to work on revision or, comments for that need some work. DTE has mentioned that they're willing to take a crack at, defining one of the word phrases up here. Sorry, want to make sure I get all my points here. For the definitions portion here, we see those as being, they may not be something that we tackle right away, but I think that we want to get a good sense of where we're going in the other focus areas before we attack the definition. So in order to elaborate on that a little bit, we don't want to work on a definition for, say, a planned interruption if that won't be part of the rule set. So hopefully that makes sense for everyone. Under the second item here, so the meter inspection, testing, and accuracy and location, that's also a focus area that we see. Staff, we see this as a really big area that needs to be addressed. We feel that the rules as they're written right now really pertain to analog meters and are not reflective of the modern meters that are in the utility systems today. So we see, I had mentioned that we're working with utility companies and their meter experts to, look at this rule set. And one of the items was to look at how ANSI Z 1.9 compares to 1.4. The thought was that 1.4 should be used. So there's a separate effort there. We have a call on January 15th to kind of get things going with that, and then we plan to meet and continue working in this area. Under cybersecurity here, so this really ties in with a lot of what Brian had shared in his presentation. Obviously, it's a focus area that was called out from the energy assessment, and something that we're looking to get or have a requirement for. And Brian talked about the straw man proposal and potentially having a separate subgroup for this as well. But certainly a focus area that we're looking to address with the work that we're doing here. The next one under accident and incident reporting. Based on the research that we have performed with the multi-state review, staffs anyway, we felt that it may be beneficial to include this and update the accident and incident reporting. As it is right now, serious injury and fatalities are reported to us, but we're looking at potentially expanding that and including more additional language in that area. Vegetation management and operations and maintenance. Again, this was one that we really looked into for the multi-state review. Felt that some of the other states had some vegetation management requirements that we feel may be beneficial, knowing that the utilities they're getting more tree trim spend. There's a lot more tree trim activity going on right now. And I think we want to consider the notifications for, make sure that people in the area know what's going on ahead of the tree trim, and that we feel that it could be beneficial to bring that type of language into the rule set. Along with that, it kind of ties in with the preventative maintenance. We talked about potentially including that into maybe a reporting, or there was discussions that, hey, this is already in the distribution planning process, so we don't need it, but certainly something we want to talk about and explore. The next one here, advanced technologies. This kind of ties in with the meter inspection and testing and everything, but we want to make sure that we consider the modern meters that are in the system today. And the one that comes to mind for this is looking at momentary interruptions. We feel that with AMI, utilities have more access to that type of detail that could be used to enhance customer satisfaction. So, and we talked about how momentary interruptions do have a cost implication that is sometimes overlooked. So under Rule 411 there, we've talked about this one as well, but we'll also see it as a focus area for extension of electric service. Yeah, there was mention that there are a lot of orders out there. There's a lot of guidance to, shed some light and provide interpretation on the rule that I think generally the idea was that you shouldn't overlook those, and that if you change these, then that could have a significant impact on the rule. But this is certainly an area we want to continue to focus on and explore further as well. The last one here, but certainly not least, is the standard frequency for alternating current systems. We had mentioned that not all clocks are synchronized to the grid, so really looking at how that could be updated as well. Okay, so additional considerations beyond sort of the focus areas. So we had mentioned all these as well, but we want to make sure that the update to the technical standards for electric service are consistent with the technical standards for gas service. Just make sure that the flow and meaning are consistent between the two industries. Really, I see these additional considerations areas as being those that will help with consistency, clarity, and readability with the text standards. So The second one there is the billing rule amendments. So we have been working with our customer assistance division with looking at what billing rule requirements are in the tech standards, which ones we may take from the tech standards because they may be duplicative, or we feel like they may be better in the billing rule only. So another here under the third check mark is the incorporated standards to reference instead of adding language, and this one was really something that we noticed as you look at our current tech standards. There are instances, one in the billing rules comes to mind, where we refer to a standard but also include language from that standard in the rules. So we want to make sure that we kind of clean that up, and we feel at this point in time that it would be good to just refer to the standard itself rather than bringing the actual language of that standard into the technical standards rule set. So the last one here, incorporate electrical supply and communications lines and associated equipment rule set. I've talked about this one, how that incorporates the NESC. We feel that rule set could be brought into the technical standards and really eliminated. So obviously these are considerations and things we're thinking about right now as we progress here. Nothing set in stone by any means. And so what I did for the next few slides here is sort of break down the parts, use our focus areas and based on the color, and place them into the part for which we feel they would fall under, the part of the technical standards that they would fall under. So I'll just give an example for part one here. So part one, the update to the definitions is in brown. I think it's brown. And then it corresponds to the definition, the first bullet there in definition. So as you look through these, I just wanted to make sure everyone understood that. So in part one, updating the definitions, obviously that's one of the focus areas. Under part two there, for green, which is the O&M, potential for updates, or the focus ties to the focus area of O&M, and update to include reporting of the OSHA incidents. Again, we require that OSHA be followed, but don't necessarily require reporting of any accidents or anything. So thinking about bringing that into part two. Under update to include reporting and momentary interruptions. That's one we were thinking of for under part two there. Under part three, for the metering requirements, we were potentially thinking about updating these. Well, we're thinking about updating these to reflect the modern meters and include the meter location. Under part four, there's also, we felt that the meter location requirement, if there does turn out to be one, could also fall under customer relations. And then also under part four is to update to include 411 amendments if those amendments are executed. Under part five here, so engineering, we're cybersecurity piece. We at this point feel that they would fall, the requirements for that would fall under part five under engineering here. We also felt that more prescriptive inspection program requirements, falling under the O&M focus area, would fall under the engineering part five. Update to additional vegetation management requirements, also an O&M tie, would fall under part five as well. The update to include the electrical supply, so the reference to the NESC, we figure would fall under the engineering part here. Under part six, for metering equipment inspections and tests, again, with the metering work focus areas, we felt that this should be updated to reflect the modern meters in the system today. Under part seven, so for standards and quality of services, Update to reflect the voltage information obtained through advanced technologies, mainly through AMI. There's also the communication at a substation level through SCADA, where utilities have, voltage information available to them through that as well. So, also under Part 7, to update 701 to address the fact that there are very few clocks that are synchronized to the grid, which we talked about. And then under Part 8 of safety there, update to include the additional reporting of accidents and incidents potentially. So, right, Marco, yeah.
Maybe just a clarifying question on process and how we would go about it. And I'll just, pick one as an example. More prescriptive inspection program requirements. So that was an area where it seemed like from some of the analysis before, California had focused, but a lot of the other states had not. I'm not saying that we shouldn't focus on this area. It's maybe more about process. And do you have any thoughts about how one might go about it? I think some of the utility comments were utilities are all different equipment, different vintages. Have you given some thought about maybe this pulls together a work group to start thinking about different options and different levels of potential reporting requirements and guidelines around how to do the inspections?
Yeah, definitely. So we see this as an area, and I'll talk about it later, but really, we see this as an opportunity for the utilities in future work group sessions to, present, hey, we don't think that this should be done because of X, Y, and Z, or hey, this is what we currently have for, let's say, a preventative maintenance program, and maybe it's difficult to share. I don't know, but we're certainly open to, honing in on those areas and more of the specifics as we work in future work group sessions. So. Yeah.
Douglas Jester, Five Lakes Energy. Back on the reporting and records section, I'd like to basically ask for comment on whether you've thought about including reporting of sort of out of range events on frequency and voltage, because I think both of those are sufficiently important that a reporting standard would be appropriate.
Okay, yeah, that's a great comment. I know for voltage, variances of voltage, I think that could potentially come into play as we look at what AMI, the information that the utilities have through AMI. But as far as the frequency goes, I'm not sure. I think it could definitely be explored. So yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so next I'll move into sort of the last few slides here. So talking about the assignment that's due, we have a due date of January 17th for this one. It's a little bit shorter time frame than what we had for the first session. The idea here is to have a little bit quicker turnaround because I think it's going to really help us in identify or coming up with the agenda for the third session, and we really want to, we expect this third and really the sessions moving from this point on to be, allow the utilities and other stakeholders to come up and present. I think that's a good example, Marco, that you kind of brought up with, maybe we have DTE talk about their preventative maintenance and like. I think that's so that's kind of the idea we're working towards here is not so heavy, not being so heavy on the staff presentation. So. So the comments that we are planning to get with this, really looking for comments on the focus areas. So if you have any specific language recommendations, we're looking to, looking for you to share those specific considerations and suggestions that you have that may not have been covered yet. So if you say, hey, we need to really look into this as well, I think with the frequencies and that Doug brought up, that's a good consideration that we should maybe look into as well there. So anything like that comes to mind as we work to narrow down our focus into these focus areas would be beneficial. So additional recommended focus areas. So anything that you feel that we may have missed in a focus area that we've already shared with you. Certainly want to know about any of those. The desire to participate in particular focus areas. We'll certainly consider any comments related to that. And then information sharing offers. So this kind of goes into what we talked about with, with this, I think that we'll look for, let's say there's a specific focus area. If the utilities have information, or anyone for that matter has information that they want to share, bring that forth, and we can, as we work through this. So. Okay, so comment submittal. This is consistent with the way we've done it for the first session as well. So really two options here. Looks like most have used option 1 here, but you can submit your written comments to the docket by emailing the address here, and then referencing for the text standards, it's docket 20630, or alternatively, you could comment by mailing it into the address here. So again, looking ahead, the next work group meeting is on February 12th, and at the MPSC offices here. I feel like we're gonna, for the first session, we identified, looked at specific comments and looked at areas where we want to consider. For the second session here, we're really looking to narrow down and concentrate our efforts by, working in these focus areas. So at some point, we'll look to get to a red line version. We feel that some areas may be further ahead than others, and we feel that that's okay. So some may have red lines before other areas, but that's where we stand for right now. So does anyone have questions?
This is Yujia from DTE. So one of my questions is, have you thought about the operation of some of these focus areas? Because you list out quite a few focus areas, and I can see that some of the definitions and some of the developments of the languages can be quite complicated. I just don't know whether it's realistic to rely on the monthly meeting. I think maybe there are another 4 or 5 meetings like this to really hone in on some of the concepts and the languages that we're going to be using. And also given the fact that a lot of these areas are covering a wide range of expertise. So, it really can help us drive the right people in the right meetings to help assist some of the development of the languages. So, is there any thoughts around that?
We've seen some of the comments. I think DTE and some others asked for some subgroups, and I know we started one with the meters. And I think we're considering that, and especially in the more complicated areas, but we do have a tight time frame also. So that's a good comment.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so as it is right now, we have 2 set work group sessions moving forward here. So February 12th, March 12th, and then tentatively for April. But we do have the initial report from staff due April 31st, and then the final report due on September 1st. So kind of a quick turnaround, but yeah, I understand though. That's a good comment.
Can I just add to that? This is Pat Poley. We have a staff report April 30th. It doesn't mean a red line version. that, we're not striving to provide a red line version on April 30th. We're just striving to get as far, along in this process as we can, understanding that these are technical issues. I think the last time these rules were revisited, it was probably a 2-year process just when the stakeholders, we don't have that. We got April 30th and September 1st to report on what we have done so far. So.
All right. There are no questions. That concludes the session for the technical standards piece. In the afternoon, sounds like a few of you who are here right now will be involved with the service quality session as well in the afternoon, and that will start off at 1 o'clock. So thanks everyone for driving out here in some pretty shaky conditions, and we appreciate your participation.